All right, so today I wanted to make a video on my opinion on index investing. This is a very popular thing, especially for younger investors. At least I find that people just buy indexes and just forget about it. And the first thing I'd mention is that there definitely is some positives. I think the simplicity behind it, the fact that you don't really have to I mean, as long as you're actually sticking to it, there's no emotional, like there's no emotions behind it or any of that kind of stuff. You don't get caught into the emotional aspect of investing or emotional aspect of individual stocks. The fact that you're guaranteed to not be worse than the market, although technically you're not guaranteed to be better as well. Though there is definitely a lot of benefits to index investing. I think there's a lot of ways of going about things that are worse. But I think there's also a lot of problems, and I think that it's not that hard to improve on it. And the first and the biggest reason by far is it depends how you index, right? That is my issue with indexing, right? And the traditional way is just buy the SPY, maybe literally just the SPY or VOO, and forget about it. The other way would be, oh, you buy, 80% SPY and then 20% a bond fund or whatever, ratio you want to name. There's other people that throw in maybe a little bit of the QQQs. There's varieties of ways of doing things. But the main first point I wanted to bring up here is that the problem with the SPY and the QQQs are significantly worse than this, is the asset allocation is not very good, right? At least in my opinion, right? And the problem is that, in my opinion, the companies that are going to do the best over the next 10 or 20 years, number one, energy, number two, materials, and they're not even 10% of the index. They're like 7% of the index, right? And so that's the big problem, right? You have 23.67% in tech, 15% in healthcare, 13 financial services, 11.39 consumer cyclical. Like, I mean, the companies that I believe you want to be underweight in, at least compared to the index going forward, is tech, consumer cyclical, um, and communication services. Those are probably the big three that I would definitely want to be underweight going forward. Um, Utilities, again, utilities are utilities. They're boring. I think it depends on the individual company. I think that there's some brutal companies in there. There is a handful of half decent ones. Industrials is another one that you, in my opinion, want to be overweight going forward, right? I mean, if I had to rank my top sectors over the next 10 or 20 years, it would be number one, energy, number two, materials, number three, industrials. I think that those are probably the clear top three. After that, I mean, I think healthcare will be okay. Real estate will also be okay. I mean, consumer staples is consumer staples. It's going to do what it's going to do. It's fairly consistent on that. Same with utilities. Um, but again, financial services, I think they'll be okay as well. Although I would probably want to be about, whatever, 10% in financial services. So I think you're a hair overweight there. Again, the QQQ is a lot worse. I believe the QQQ is like 40 or 45% tech. Probably has a tiny bit in consumer cyclical, tiny bit in financial services, maybe a tiny bit in healthcare. And other than that, it's probably, I mean, let's just take a quick look here. Yeah, you have 46% tech, 15% consumer communication services, 17% consumer cyclical, tiny bit in consumer staples, tiny bit in, like, there's literally like nothing in energy, nothing in basic materials, nothing in real estate, right? 1% financial services. So this is the problem with just blindly indexing is I think you're leaving things on the table, right? And it's not that you can't do that, right? I mean, what people would say, okay, what's the easiest way of changing course? Well, the easiest way would be, okay, well, maybe you increase you buy the energy, right? You buy XLE, right? Or um, you buy the sector ones to make up the difference, right? I think you want to be, personally, I'd want to be maybe 15 to 20% energy, 15 to 20% um, materials, maybe 10 to 15 industrials. Like, That's what I would want to make sure, right? That's what I would do to make up the difference, right? That's the easiest way of doing it. But I think the best thing is just buy good companies, right? I mean, in my opinion, it doesn't take, I mean, if you want to get that extra, like, if you want to grind out those smaller gains, that's doable, right? But I mean, if you think, like, I mean, you take me, if you think energy is going to be the best performing sector over the next 10 or 20 years, well, okay, well, why would you not go not only increase your exposure to energy, but increase your exposure to the best company or companies within that sector? I'm not saying you go crazy by any means, but to me that makes sense, right? To me that makes sense. So that is the basic problem I believe with indexing. I think the other problem too is buying bond funds as well. Buying individual bonds, not the end of the world if you can get a decent yield, but buying bond funds is a terrible idea. And until if the Fed starts cutting rates clearly, then bond funds will do okay. But again, the longer term ones, you're always going to have quite a bit of risk there, right? And this is something that I don't think is talked about enough either in the investing world is that um, longer dated. I mean, if you look at the UK, I mean, gilts are down more than Bitcoin is this year. I think it's like what is it like 50% or something, like maybe even more. So I think that people also need to be very careful there, right? I mean, if you're going to own bonds, pretty much your only option is short-term corporates, right? Maybe in that 3 to 5 year, at least in my opinion, range, because you have to get a decent enough yield. But if you go too far out, then you're taking quite a bit of duration risk, right? So I think that that's the thing when it comes to bonds, right? Now again, but the problem, other thing too, is that what percentage of everyday investors are buying their own bonds? Right? I mean, maybe you buy a mutual fund that the fund manager buys their own bonds, but then you're getting like a 1.5, 2% fee probably, right? So that's the thing when it comes to that too, is that um, I think if people just did a little bit more, put a little bit more effort into it, they could um, do better, right? And the reason that this is so popular now is it worked really good over the last 10 years, right? I mean, it worked really good. But prior to that, it didn't work good. Like there was a very short period of time where it actually worked pretty good, right? And that's another thing I don't think people are talking, enough about that. This strategy, it didn't work all that good for the vast majority of history, right? It worked very good in the 2010s and up until start of 2022, right? Because again, the best performing sectors, what were they? It was tech. It was consumer cyclical. It was real estate, basically everything that the SPY is overweight. Now, again, it makes sense because they're the ones that are the biggest things. And I think another solid way of going about it is you can buy equal weight funds. This will theoretically lower your upside, but it also lowers your downside, right? I mean, this is RSP. This is the equal weight S&P index, only down 17% for the year. So it's not down nearly as much as the SPY is. And if we look at its holdings, well, it's only 14% tech. It's virtually the same energy, but it's not nearly as overweight. Some of these, it's got more basic materials, which is good, but you're still underweight, right? You're still clearly underweight the best sectors, in my opinion, but you're not overweight some of these ones that are going to struggle, right? So again, I just wanted to talk about this because again, it's just my opinion, right? Obviously, it's just my opinion, but it's looking like you're going to be right on this one because again, in a high rate environment, tech and some of these high growth companies, they're going to struggle, right? They're going to struggle, and I think that people that are just blindly indexing, not that you're going to get killed necessarily, but you're not going to do as you otherwise could. So anyway, that's what I wanted to bring up today. If you liked the video, hit that like and subscribe if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more.